Okay, Amos, we get a fireside chat, and the title is Reality Check on the Energy Transition, Gradual or Managed. Now, I think we will get into some of that in the relatively brief time we've had, but I think this is too good an opportunity to miss, to discuss a bit about where the US sits at the moment in this energy transition world. And if we're honest, we can look to China and see 20 years of development and strategy, and perhaps over the same period of time, the US going through 20 years of offshoring and not a lot of strategy. Is this a fear of the supply routes, or is this a wake-up call to what's coming next, the big energy transition?
Well, first, thank you for having me. It's really great to be back in Saudi Arabia. Sometimes I feel like Saudi is my second home, but really great to be at the Future Minerals Forum. Look, I think it's a combination of things. The United States and President Biden came into power and realized that as we are at the early stages of an energy transition, a massive energy transition, that is a global effort that is going to cost trillions and have enormous amount of impact, and that we are not equipped to manage it from the United States perspective. One, the reliability of supply for our supply chains, and to make sure that we have the security of operations. And that's where the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, all three things happen, trillions of dollars, to incentivize investment in the United States so that we have at least a significant portion that could be supplied inside the United States. But we also realize this is not about geopolitical adversaries. You can't have an energy transition that is based on a supply that comes for the whole world, not just from the United States, from one country. So we have to do what we need to do domestically in the United States, which I think we're well on our way to do with a very successful IRA implementation. And we have to do it around the world. We have to invest together with our allies and our friends to make sure that the global system is well supplied and well diversified.
But there are, as you well know, plenty of people who say that's fine, and we understand that. But you pulled up the drawbridge with the Inflation Reduction Act. It is essentially fairly protectionist. It's not giving. It's distorting markets. It's distorting the world in terms of access to some of these areas. Do you recognize that that's an issue?
Well, I think if we were dealing with a free market and we were the one distorting it, I would understand the concern. This is not a free market to begin with. You mentioned China. China has done 20 years of investment in this area, but let's not pretend it was not a free market investment. It is remarkable amounts of subsidies. They recognized, I tip my hat off to them, they recognized it first, but spending enormous amounts of money in non-market friendly and not free market ways. And what a free market means is that people go to the cheaper option. That has meant offshoring away from the United States, away from labor standards, away from environmental standards, and ultimately not good for American economic security, national security, and not good for global economic security. And that's why what the IRA came to do is to equalize, is to say, wait a minute, we have to make sure that if we're going to have an energy transition and a digital transition, that we have to have it on the basis of high standards and security of supply. And that's what we've done. So yes, has it mobilized capital? It sure has. But my answer to people in other governments who tell me this is not to say, let's forget about the argument, you should do an IRA too. That's the level of challenge we have for the energy transition. Every other country should also make incentives for additional investment.
But doesn't that push towards, we've heard quite a lot here about the importance of partnerships, collaboration, cooperation, a multilateral approach if we're going to reach some of these energy transition goals, because of course it's not down to any individual country. And what we're seeing at the moment is actually the opposite, which is a sort of nationalization, which is it's a silo attitude, and that's clearly not going to help in the long term.
So one, I fundamentally disagree with the premise. Yes, countries have to take specific action in their own jurisdictions to reduce the barriers to investment. and to encourage more investment in clean energy, more investment in the supply chain of clean energy and the infrastructure that it requires. But that is not mutually exclusive with also working in collaboration to invest in other countries. And the G7 announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is building the Libido corridor in Africa, where we're building a rail project, a very ambitious multi-billion-dollar rail project from Angola, hopefully all the way from west to east in Africa, that will allow for critical minerals and for electricity to be more readily available to global markets while building up standards in individual countries in Africa. We're doing this, looking at the same thing in Central and South America, in Southeast Asia. That's where the global community can come together. I come here to Saudi Arabia, I go to the United Arab Emirates, to Qatar, just in this region, to see how can we collaborate. And the last thing that's really critical that we can only do together is reducing the cost of capital. The cost of capital in America is relatively cheap.
Yeah.
In Denmark, it's relatively cheap. The cost of capital to doing this in Angola, in DRC, in Uganda, in Nigeria, is much higher. We have to bring that down. So that's where the global community to come together. So focusing on our national interests should not preclude us also focusing on a collaborative way to make sure that the energy transition is not only happening in developed countries, it is also happening in developing.
Which is obviously is critical, particularly as you reference, debt-laden countries with mineral resource. There's a no-brainer in there, isn't there, as an opportunity to help in that regard. So, again, coming back to the reality check, COP28 spelt out, clear as day, we need to triple the amount of renewable energy by 2030. That is going to take a vast amount of mining and extraction and processing and supply. Is that a time frame, in your view, from what you can see, that is remotely achievable?
Yes, and because I think we have to stop looking at the past as the guide to the future, and we have to stop looking even at the present and say, this is what I have today. With these tools, will I achieve the great future? The answer is no. The answer is that we have to make investment into R&D, into that step change, and constantly assume and expect that I will make changes in technology that will enable it. So do I have the exact clear pathway? No. But what it starts with is, from the government side, commitment, policy, and from the private side, looking at that signal, that demand signal that government is sending and the international community is sending towards investment. And that's what the IRA really did. And to be fair, that's what the Paris Accords did. Look at the level of investment, of direction of travel. Look what the UAE just announced on Altera, $30 billion towards investment. Saudi Arabia is investing in these areas, Norway, et cetera, sovereign wealth funds. That is unlocking enormous amount of potential investment. And I think that's how we get there. I'm excited whenever I talk to companies just in the hallways here at this forum about new technologies for batteries that won't need as many metals and minerals. Now, that won't happen in the next 5 years, but the future means that I don't know what the battery is going to be made of, but I can know one thing. It's not going to have a 200-mile radius or discharge distance for range. It's going to be more efficient. It will probably be a recyclable, and it will be more efficient and effective to manufacture than it is today. How exactly? I don't know. But that's why I'm so bullish and optimistic about how we get to that 2050 future.
That's a big leap of faith in technology and human ingenuity, I suppose, to a certain extent. 2030 is 6 years away. Is it going to happen by then? I mean, that's my point. It's so tight. Well, it's tomorrow.
Yes, and we have to keep going. Look where we were. If you look at the estimates 15 years ago, 2010, 2009, and I told you that some countries in Europe are going to be over 50 and some at 100% EV sales. You tell me it's impossible. So it's easy to tell me what's not going to work. I live in a world where I get up every morning excited because I think of what everybody tells me can't work that I think will work. So 2030 is only a few years away, but the signal that the market gets from government is so important. And that's why I want to go back to your question about, are you interfering in the market? The definition of interference is complicated. I think that government saying, by this year, we're going to have a standard, and you have 10 years to meet that standard, it tells the private sector, here's what I'm going to invest in. And because I know I'm going to have a market for it. So what I see it is not interference in the market, but rather creating a market. The government has the power not only to set regulations, but it is the most important offtake guarantee by saying, you're going to be able to sell this product. And then the market starts saying, wait a minute, if that's true, how do I invest so that I'm the best product by then, that I'm the most ready by 2030, by 2035? And maybe we miss the goal. So you tell me 2030 is a goal and we miss it. And my answer to you is, and if we get there in 2033, that's a bad thing? No, because if I didn't set 2030, I wouldn't get there in 33. So we have to set goals. When we said we'd go to the moon, nobody knew how we'd get there. We just said we would, and we made it happen. So that is how we have to approach this energy transition, because it's so big and it encompasses the two great generational transitions the world's going through. One is energy and one is in the technology sector, but they're related. There are more chips in an EV than there are in a gasoline car. So these are all things that have to move together.
The title was Reality Check. I think that's the most optimistic and positive sort of reality check that we could expect in a 10 to 12 minute chat here on the stage. But I really appreciate that, and thank you very much indeed for your time. Great to have you here.
It's a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amos Hochstein.